It's January 8, Ukraine Media Center continues its operation. My name is Svetlana Shaprenko, and now we will be talking about the ways we can use to bring Ukrainian Marines back home, and we're talking about it today for a reason. Today is day 1000 that the Ukrainian Marines who were defending Mariupol have been spending in the Russian captivity. Some of them are in very difficult condition, and our task, the task is to bring them back home. It's our task and task of our international partners. And to discuss it, we've invited Anastasia Savova, head and co-founder of the Association Marine Corps Strength, daughter of a prisoner of war, Bohdan Okhrimenko, representative of the coordination headquarters for the treatment of prisoners of war in Ukraine, Olena Belyachkova, coordinator of the group of families of POWs and missing persons and the Media Initiative for Human Rights, and Bohdan Chumak, Counselor, Department of International Law, Ukraine Minister of Foreign Affairs. Good afternoon, dear friends. So, Miss Anastasia, you're a daughter of a Ukrainian Marine held in captivity. You're head of the organization who is taking their best efforts to bring our prisoners of war back home as soon as possible. So what do we know for the time being about our defenders? What is their number? What is their condition? What do we know about the condition of their detention, condition of their captivity in Russian Federation? Good afternoon. Currently, more than 1,300 Marines are being held in captivity. Every other of them has some difficult illnesses that they acquired due to their captivity in Russian Federation. Within these 1,000 days, we held a number of meetings, manifestations, international meetings. There was a lot of work done, but because of the cowardly nature of our enemy, we don't know the exact number of the Marines who ended up in captivity. We don't know the exact number of those missing in action because Russia conceals Ukrainian prisoners of war. That's their systemic government policy. Within these 1,000 days, more than 50 Marines Marines' bodies were returned, those who were tortured to death, and we don't know when the rest of them will be brought back to Ukraine. Our work is the support of the families, support of those who are staying in captivity, search, advocacy. We understand that currently the situation is extremely difficult because the people have been spending a lot of time in terrible, inhumane conditions, and a lot of them due to constant beating, torturing, and violation of the basic needs are in terrible condition. They got difficult illnesses and they get no medical aid. Marines are not only the officers, commissioned and non-commissioned, as well as sergeants and soldiers, but also like musicians and other supply specialties. Many of them were condemned by Russian Federation and sentenced to life sentences. Thanks to the efforts of the partners, we can bring them back, but the majority of them are still staying in captivity. We're thinking that 1,000 days is too much to stay in that hell those people ended up in. And today we want to present a pin that will become a symbol for all of the prisoners, both military and civilian. The bird whose wings are tied with a barbed wire, which means it not only cannot fly, but it has no freedom. It fully depends on the conditions it was put in, just like our prisoners of war, fully deprived of their freedom and not being able to bear responsibility for anything in their life. Our families are also suffering because of uncertainty, because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know whether our relatives are coming back alive. We don't know whether Russia chooses to give them back or to just hide them forever and kill them, to blow them up like they did. That's yet another reason we've gathered here to draw everyone's attention to the fact that the Marines are the category that is staying in captivity in one of the biggest numbers, that the Marines were the first ones to take up their arms to defend our homeland. And we want all of the Ukrainians not to forget thanks to whom they can drink their coffee in the morning. And we urge everybody to support us and to spread the truth about captivity, no matter how difficult is this information. Just imagine you're feeling it difficult to hear like someone got ill or someone got their legs cut. But that's the story of someone's father, someone's brother. We want everybody to feel this unity, and we would like to hand over the pin to the diplomats to spread it over the diplomatic offices so that you wear them, so that you remind your colleagues that the violence, killings, and aggression cannot remain impune. And we want everybody to remember that the justice will come. Miss Anastasia, there is your personal story behind it. Your father is staying in captivity. What do you know about him? Yes, my father has been staying in captivity along with the others for more than 1,000 days. For what I know, he's sick with tuberculosis. He's got mortification of legs. His health condition is difficult, but unfortunately, I don't know where he was moved to, and I'm not sure if he's alive now and what's going on about him. It's terrible not to be able to get in touch with the person, not to be able to find out what's going on about them. And this is the story for all of the Marines, because now in Russia they have about 200 places of detention where they keep the Ukrainian prisoners of war. And we don't know, maybe there are more places like that, because that's the information from the places where people were set free from. There's a full media isolation, full silence about what's going on inside there, and the majority of international organizations unfortunately cannot set up their connections and to fulfill their statutory obligations that they have, so we could find out at least something, so we could tell those people that they're not forgotten, they're being fought for, that we wait for them over here. Thank you, Miss Anastasia, for the great job you're doing, for the great job your organization is doing, and for your story. My next question is to Mr. Bohdan, the representative of Coordination Headquarters. Russian Federation neglects all of the standards of international law, including the Convention on Handling of Prisoners of War. So how do you respond to it? How do you make it finding out the information about the prisoners of war, and how do you cooperate with their families? Well, good afternoon. Really, 1,000 days is too much. Specifically, as we're talking about human lives, human destinies, and the number of the prisoners, they still have the status of the missing in action, and the number of those confirmed by Russian Federation or the ICRC as those held in captivity was about 3,000, and by now we were able to bring back about 505 Marines from different areas, mostly from those having defended Mariupol. And talking about our partners, I would like to thank our partner countries. We emphasize it during every exchange. The Middle Eastern countries such as United Arab Emirates, other countries that got involved in this work. And on the other hand, we're seeing full helplessness of the international organizations in terms of pressure they could exercise over Russian Federation and the access to the places of detention of Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian prisoners. It's not only about the military. There's a lot of Ukrainian civilians staying in Russian torture chambers. Recent visit to Geneva to the conference of International Federation of Red Cross demonstrated that the problem of the war of Ukraine is not being paid sufficient attention by the International Federation of Red Cross, and the capabilities of International Committee of Red Cross are also limited. They say they're not admitted, and in response to our question, what are they doing to overcome those obstacles? Well, it all boils down to some diplomatic communications. So first of all, we insist on establishment of the mixed medical commissions because it's one of the most efficient mechanisms at Ukrainian party for the third time in the history established such commissions. We've made all of the steps necessary. We've handed over the necessary documents to International Committee of Red Cross. We've identified the doctors, the independent doctors, and we we're waiting for the agreement by Russian Federation. And as we ask ICRC whether Russia agrees, they say no, they do not agree. And when we ask them, what have you done to force them to do so? Because the establishment of Mixed Medical Commission is mandatory under the convention. Well, and we get no response. We get no answer. They try to suggest some alternative ways, but we insist on fulfillment of the conditions contemplated for all of the parties to the conflict. Once again, let me reiterate it. Ukraine recently, in December, applied to ICRC for an umpteenth time, and yesterday I got an answer that they were not able to seek positive response from Russian Federation, so the work is still underway in this area. The work is underway on the search of alternative ways. For example, when it comes to patron countries, we work actively with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There are some shifts, and hopefully the year 2025 will yield some positive results in this area. I really hope it's going to happen. Talking about the health condition is really important because many of the military and civilians were detained, were taken captive in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, let alone those who were staying in captivity before the year 2022. We sometimes don't know anything about their health condition. We can get information from different sources, but the key source of information is definitely interviewing of those set free from their captivity. This is the source we're getting the information about the health condition of the others from. There are other sources such as Main Directorate of Intelligence, the Foreign Intelligence Service, State Security Service of Ukraine, and everything that can be communicated to the citizens, we communicate it to through the personal accounts. Now the team of coordination headquarters works with those who were set free. We're getting information from them, and if a serviceman is registered as one missing in action, we changed this category to the captivity confirmed by other sources. The information is being updated in the personal account, and for quality communication with the family, starting with the beginning of this year in their personal accounts, we've launched another service, the excerpt from their account that the relatives can use in their best interests, where they need it in different social services or in other government offices. A person can request this excerpt using a personal computer or their personal phone. It provides documented information about the category. If we know about the place of detention, then it comes with the place of detention. The rest of information is classified, including for the families, because a lot of matters they require verification, and we add the information, all of the information, to the personal cards of the person, of a person held captive or missing in action, and then the analysts work to develop certain negotiation position for our negotiators. The negotiators can find out the details through the information system, like the place of detention, the health condition, if such information is provided, and we are going to expand the interface of the personal accounts. I think it's going to become a more convenient tool, and probably the only ones who used all of the capabilities of the government platform. It was us, and we used it for our information system. And when it comes to the negotiations, it's difficult to understand. It's the elite unit of Ukrainian armed forces, and communication about their return is difficult. Hopefully, in the year 2025, the new mechanisms that are being currently developed, they will yield their results. Thank you, Mr. Bohdan. Now let's continue about the diplomatic side. So, Mr. Bohdan, can you please tell us what is the diplomatic track to bring our prisoners of war back home? Good afternoon. Thank you. Well, one of the diplomatic ways, the most efficient in our opinion, is the patron state. Is currently absent, but we continue working in this area. We hope that the work done during the last month of the year 2024 and the guidance of Minister Sabiga will yield positive results. Ukraine will get its patron state, and it will allow us to get the functionality contemplated by Geneva Conventions, specifically the possibility by the representatives of the patron state to visit the prisoners of war to acquire information about their health condition. Then the representatives of the patron states will be able to attend to the court hearings and to search for attorneys who may defend our prisoners of war in those pseudo courts, and handing over of the correspondence to the prisoners of war and getting correspondence from the prisoners of war. And it also provides opportunities for repatriation of heavily wounded and heavily ill, and to create yet another opportunity for efficient exchange of the prisoners of war. So why do you think that tool may become efficient? Russia has been ignoring any provisions of international law within all those 3 years. In fact, they're covering their crimes. A lot of people who are being held there in captivity, they're not supposed to be staying there. A lot of the military are staying in a very bad condition, being tortured. So they are not supposed to be treated like this. So why, in your opinion, can the patron state change this situation? Why, in your opinion, Ukraine is going to get any information or more information about their prisoners of war? Well, first of all, Russia has to agree to it. The patron countries should be coming from the list of neutral countries. But we cannot fully agree if Russia, or we cannot fully hope that Russia agrees to do it during this year, but we shouldn't stop any negotiations, any consultation. We shouldn't stop searching for the ways to, first of all, make sure that there are neutral countries who are ready to talk about it with Russian Federation. But at the same time, we have to understand, no matter how isolated Russia wants to be, but in order to continue existing, they still need contacts with the external world, and it already creates probably small but still some opportunities. If Russia consents to the suggested patron state, the patron state of Ukraine in Russian Federation, it's going to establish an obligation of Russia before that state, not before Ukraine. And no matter how bad Russia wants it, but they are going, or doesn't want it, but they're going to face the choice whether they violate their agreements with that country, is creating new diplomatic problems, or they still start fulfilling those obligations that are contemplated within the framework of the agreement with that patron country. Thank you, Mr. Bohdan, for your explanation. Ms. Olena, can you please tell us what are the difficulties faced by the families of the captive Marines getting information about them, bringing them back home? So how do those successful stories happen when the prisoners of war are being brought back home? Well, the successful stories about the Marines who got captive during the defense of Mariupol, they got renewed during the year 2024 when we've seen the representatives of Azov and Marines among those exchanged, and we hope that this successful work on bringing them back home will continue. The facts that Anastasia was mentioning, the absence of information about the places of captivity, is related to the fact that Russia frequently transports and changes the places of captivity of our prisoners of war. And just like Anastasia has mentioned, the number of new places of captivity is growing. Russia transports our military, our prisoners of war, from Donetsk and Luhansk regions to Russian Federation. We keep finding out about the new places of detention, and again, information about the new places is only available to us as soon as we got someone liberated from those places. We find out about the conditions, about the place of captivity, and the fact of the absence of medical aid, or failure to provide the medical aid. 12 bodies were returned dead, tortured to death. Frequently, those people were heavily ill, which evidences that no medical aid was provided, and the conditions that they were staying in were terrible, which led to their death. So those are the critical global problems, and we understand that the longer is the term of captivity, the heavier, the worse is their condition, both physical and mental, because it's a long way of resocialization and getting back to normal life after rehabilitation. Again, Russian Federation sentences our Marines for long terms, sometimes for life sentences, and then they're being transported to the most terrible places of detention where the Russian criminals are staying, and our military, our prisoners of war who were already sentenced are staying with those criminals. And those exchanges, when when the Marines who were sentenced to long terms are being exchanged, it lets us know that they still can be brought back home. And just like other panelists says, the search for other mechanisms is underway that potentially may improve the results. Probably not to bring them back home, but at least to save their lives and health, the health of our Marines, both male and female. So this idea of patron state would really help. Mr. Bohdan had started describing the capabilities available to the patron state, not only visiting the prisoners of war, not only checking their health condition, not only attending to the court proceedings, but also the exchange of information. The patron state supports the ICRC, who's getting a lot of blame. So they have this function to get the list of those held captive by Russian Federation. That would increase the amount of information for Ukraine, for the families, about those who are staying in captivity and what could be their condition, their health condition. International practice says that it shouldn't be one patron country. If Russia agrees to a country suggested by Ukraine as a country who wants to get services from a patron state, they may suggest their patron state. There are no restrictions about it. Ukraine has no reasons to conceal anything. Ukraine admits the representatives of ICRC and any other international institutions to prove that Ukraine complies with the provisions of international humanitarian law and the conventions to the fullest extent possible. Why does Russia avoid the establishment of the mixed medical commissions? Because their agreement of candidates will evidence that Russia is undertaking certain obligations, because the provisions about the mixed medical commissions says that the country that holds the prisoners of war captive, they have to fulfill the decisions or the resolutions of the mixed medical commissions within 3 months. So it's easier to ignore this requirement rather than to launch it. But still, we have to continue looking for diplomatic ways to make sure that the patron state is agreed upon, and it will definitely reinforce the work of the ICRC. It's not going to overlap their responsibilities. Well, it will only reinforce them, and probably then ICRC will start working more efficiently. We will understand, we will see that those heavily ill, heavily wounded will be brought back home, because we know that a lot of them are still staying in captivity. We know it from the information provided by those who were set free from captivity. So those are the difficulties that we're facing now. We understand that everything is a lot is in the hands of the families who take titanic efforts. All those manifestations that they have, they all have one goal: to bring back their family members, their loved ones, at least to bring them back alive, and our medicine is going to do the rest. Thank you very much, Ms. Anastasia. So, dear friends, if you have any questions on the floor, please raise your hand and you will get the mic.
Yeah. Are you hearing from international media about these captive defenders? Because I do not see it in BBC, CNN. They come here to talk about other parts of war, but are they coming to talk about the captive defenders? And number two, if they do come and talk about it, do they spend more time talking about how Ukrainians hold Russians, or do they come to ask about how Ukrainian defenders are being held? Дуже дякую.
Хто готовий відповісти?
Well, who's ready to answer? Well, when it comes to the access of foreign journalists, the coordination headquarters, they have their practice, they have a roadmap how we work with international journalists, foreign journalists, for example, for an interview with the Russian prisoners of war. If there is an application coming from a foreign media, the representatives are supposed to undergo the accreditation. We provide the permit where the Russian prisoners of war are being held, and only upon the consent of the specific prisoners of war being kept in our camps, they may be allowed to give interview to foreign media. And by now there were about 50 visits by both foreign representatives of foreign and Ukrainian media to the places of detention of Russian prisoners of war in Ukraine. In the same way, the servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine, as well as the Ukrainian civilians who are being brought back from captivity, they have all the opportunities to give interviews to any media outlets if they are being asked about it. And can you please repeat your second question?
Mainly, I'm concerned, there's not enough coverage. We're not seeing the amount of coverage necessary for this story, for the families, for the situation of waiting. I don't see it in the Western media. So what I'm concerned is, yes, there's a process to do this, but is the quantity there? There's not enough coverage. It's not sufficient of the conditions that the captives are held in Russian captivity, but a lot of spotlight is always put on what Ukrainians do with Russians. So it's the quantity I'm interested in. Дуже дякую.
Дякую за запитання. І я хотів
Well, thank you for your question. What I would like to say, it's not only about the coverage of suffering in the Western media, but again, Coordination Headquarters has a systemic policy to involve the families of those who were set free from captivity, getting them involved in advocacy campaigns in PESI, in EU, in United States, everywhere, in all platforms where we can tell the stories of our liberated prisoners of war. We keep involving the families of those who were set free so they can tell their stories in those big platforms to give publicity to those terrible conditions of captivity in Russian prisons. Yeah, I would also like to add our organization called Media Initiative for Human Rights. We cover the stories, the conditions of captivity, well, of course, upon their consent, and in order to cover that topic, not to do any harm to those who are staying in captivity, but for the world to witness the terrible conditions of captivity in Russian prisons. We know that in some places of captivity, in the most terrible ones, there was information that the conditions were improved there. So again, that's a small, but still it's a result of our human rights work related to coverage of those stories. And we continue working actively with the families, communicating with the families, covering different stories, including those about the Marines and their families, because not only the prisoners of war are staying in terrible conditions, but also their families are staying in terrible psychological condition. Unfortunately, there are relatives who haven't made it, waiting for their family members coming back from Russian prisons. So there are representatives of the families of the Marines in this room today. Why so much attention to the Marines? First of all, because it's been 1,000 days and because they're getting the most cruel treatment. And the story behind it is that the Marines who were staying in Crimea during annexation in 2014, they remained loyal to their allegiance. And some of the military who were set free, who were exchanged, they were saying that there were Marines put in their cells and they were confirming that they were getting the most cruel treatment. Well, let me add a couple of words. We have some recommendations in the website of the coordination headquarters for those who still wait for their loved ones to be brought back home, who are still staying in captivity. About the interviews, I would like to emphasize that what the guys who were liberated talk about, it may somehow affect those who are staying in captivity. That's why we recommend to adhere to certain instructions as you give interviews in order not to give not to do any harm to those who are staying in captivity. But you're absolutely right. We have to tell their stories to the whole world, and it's really necessary. Are there any more questions? What is the number of Russian prisoners of war held in Ukrainian captivity, and what is the number of Ukrainian prisoners of war held in Russian captivity? Because sometimes Mr. Kirill Bohdanov is saying we should exchange all for all, and we would like to find out, are there such exchanges going to happen? I mean, statistically, what is the number of Ukrainian military being held captive in Russia, and what is the number of Russian prisoners of war in Ukraine? Mr. Bohdan? Well, I apologize right away. I'm not telling you any numbers. That's classified information. The only thing I can say is that, unfortunately, the number is not proportional. The number of our military and civilians who are being held captive by Russia is way bigger than the Russian ones held in Ukrainian captivity. But again, please remember, 20% of our territory is occupied. About 3 million of Ukrainian citizens are hostages, are potential prisoners of Russian terroristic regime having occupied a territory. Well, the coordination headquarters still adheres to the potential idea of exchange all against all. This idea contemplates return of all of the Russian prisoners of war to Russia and bringing all of the Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian hostages back home. This is the idea of exchanging all for all against all. We don't stop working in this area, but there are certain obstacles on the Russian side that impede us from talking about some potential opportunities. Well, another question is then, if there is a country, an intermediary who may influence somehow, will you pay special attention to bringing back the servicemen of the 36th Marine Brigade? Well, how do you put together the lists for exchanges? Should more of the servicemen of the 36th Brigade be included in those lists? Because the coordination headquarters says that about 1,100 prisoners of war were brought back home during this year, and about 3,000 and something within the 3 years of the big war, and only 505 Marines during this year. And we know that their number is about 3,000 or even more. So how can the third country influence Russia to make sure that the specifically representatives of the 36th Marine Brigade are liberated, are being brought back home at least this year? Well, thank you for your question. Well, let me give you a little bit more details about the exchanges. So the total number of those liberated is 3,256. During the last year, we've brought back home a little bit more than 1,300. If we find a third country, an intermediary country, we will touch upon the matter of bringing back home certain categories and Marines specifically. Do we have any more questions on the floor? Good afternoon, Detector Media, Kobolan. Two small questions. First, is Russian propaganda actively uses the topic of the prisoners of war? They keep publishing different videos with the prisoners of war to conduct certain psyops. What is your vision of efficient countermeasures to Russian propaganda? It's probably more of a matter of strategic communications. And another question is about the captive foreigners. The foreigners are staying with the Ukrainian military in Russian captivity. What is the situation about them? Thank you for this question. Well, really, all this time, even before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, as a main Directorate of Intelligence, the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine was keeping track of different psyops coming from the enemy. With the beginning of the full-scale invasion, they intensified significantly, and countermeasures to such psyops is the direct responsibility of main Directorate of Intelligence and the Ministry of Defense, obviously. And when it comes to the coordination headquarters as an auxiliary government office, we've established a number of projects that are itself a countermeasures to the psyops related to the prisoners of war. The projects that we've launched under the patronage of the coordination headquarters, one of them is called I Want to Live. It's aimed at the servicemen of the Russian Federation to make sure they surrender. We've built the whole system, the whole mechanism that ensures the Russian servicemen can get in touch with us, they can surrender. What are the teams who receives them, what is the information that we publish about it, if they want to be brought back to Russia during exchanges, we make legends for them as if they were captured during the combat. If those people want to go public and tell about the crimes happening in the armed forces of Russian Federation, they become public. We have successful cases of surrendering the whole unit, surrendering the material. Then another project is called I Want to Find. It's aimed at the communication with the citizens of Russian Federation who are looking for their family members who were forcibly or voluntarily sent to the so-called special military operation, which in fact is a bloody war against Ukraine. And we debunk the myth about Russian Federation suffering no losses. Unfortunately, they clearly realize that our project is a threat to them. We keep witnessing cyber attacks, phishing attacks on those projects. But for your understanding, this project I Want to Live has got more than 50 million visits from Russian Federation. I Want to Find, we found more than 50,000 servicemen of Russian Federation who were gone missing in action or ended up in captivity in our territory. Then yet another project of ours is Collaborationist, which has a lot of goals. First of all, to cease any cooperation with the enemy, to restrict any cooperation with the enemy, and to bring back home, so to say, those who want to go to Russia. And there are also a number of projects in development who hopefully are going to yield some good results. Well, we have time for one more question. Anastasia Savova, Media Initiative for Human Rights. I would like to ask Mr. Bohdan, the representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I would like to ask you whether there are countries which consent to become a patron state, or maybe there is some information in development. Well, there is a number of consultations with different countries, but given the fact of sensitivity of this diplomatic process, Russia can influence it. Well, unfortunately, we cannot give you the list of such countries. And Ms. Anastasia, well, I would like actually to demonstrate our pin and to hand it over to those present here. Well, this is the bird, and I would like to give it to those in this room. Please wear it and remind to the whole world, and specifically to your colleagues, the people you keep seeing, please remind them about the Ukrainian prisoners of war rotting in Russian torture chambers. Thank you. Thank you very much. Hopefully all those joint efforts are going to yield some good results, and this year we will be able to bring back as much Ukrainian Marines and other military as possible. And let me remind you, we were talking about the ways we can use to bring the Ukrainian prisoners of war back home. And just in a couple of minutes, we will be talking to the representatives of State Emergency Service about the winter holidays and the number of reports to the State Emergency Service during the winter holidays. Stay tuned.